Welcome to the Catholic Community Scripture Study, held at St. John the Evangelist Catholic Church in Jackson, Michigan. I will be your host, Todd Gale, as we walk our way through the Gospel according to St. Matthew. Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Matthew's Gospel. We are in chapter 23, starting with the first verse. I'm recording live from San Antonio today. Jesus has been in the boxing ring all day with the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the Herodians, scribes, back and forth, verbal punches, tongue lashing. And now Jesus walks away from those bozos and starts talking directly with the people. And he's talking to them, and it looks as though this is still in the court of the Gentiles, in the temple. A year earlier, Jesus had begun to denounce the Pharisees and warned his disciples of their teaching, but now this is becoming very, very public, and he's holding nothing back. It talks about Moses' seat. The synagogues had a stone seat at the front where the authoritative teacher literally sat. But it would be the same kind of thing as today if we talk about a teacher's seat as, the professor's chair, the chair of studies of biblical history in a college, that type of thing. In Catholicism, each cathedral of the bishop has a bishop's chair, the cathedra. And the cathedral is the house of the bishop's chair, right? So it basically means they're sitting in the office of Moses. Now they expected more of them. They expected more of others, the Pharisees did, than they did of themselves. They set heavy burdens on others, yet they themselves didn't do anything, is what Jesus is saying. Jesus had a burden that was light, and his yoke was easy, and he is clearly saying, do not imitate them. One of the good notes that I found said, these religious leaders were burden bringers, and Jesus was a burden taker. I really like that. I thought that was good. So they do their works to be seen. They live for the praise of men. They advertise their righteous deeds. Jesus talked about all this in the Sermon on the Mount in chapter 6. And they make their phylacteries broad. And those are the small leather boxes that Jewish men would wear with scriptures on them, tied to the forehead, to straps on the forehead, and tied around the arm. And these little leather boxes had tiny, tiny scriptures written in tiny, tiny print. And they were to remind them to always pray and to always remember the Mosaic law. It basically had the Shema on it from Deuteronomy chapter 11 that we talked about previously. The Hebrew word for these little leather boxes is tephilim. In Greek, it's phylactery. And it was natural for these religious leaders to believe that, if they had larger phylacteries, it showed that they were more spiritual. In fact, they were super spiritual. They had giant phylacteries, and their prayer shawls were very obvious, so everybody knew. It would be like for us today, wearing a huge scapular on the outside of your clothes, like a cape, or a giant 3-foot cross around your neck, right? It's that kind of thing. The religious leaders loved it when people admired their spirituality, and they coveted the seats of honor. And they really loved the honorary titles. So this little section, when Jesus says, call no man father, it's a little confusing to many. Jesus is saying to avoid excessive titles of honor and praise that would make them equal to God the Father and to the Messiah, who is the teacher, and the Messiah is the master. So some Protestants will often ask Catholics, why do we call priests father? Why do we call the Pope Papa, right? Well, I always ask them, do you call your father, father, your dad, right? Do you call your teachers teacher? Do you call a doctor, right? I don't think many of us have masters, although sometimes our employers may seem that way. But from the rest of Scripture, we could see too that Jesus is clearly talking here in hyperbole. He said this as a little bit of an exaggeration because Jesus himself was called rabbi, and Paul called himself a father. And Paul called other Christians his children, and all the Jews and all the early Christians, and Jesus himself called Abraham Father Abraham. So in context with this whole section, what Jesus is talking about is those who love honorary titles. They love the prestige and dignity that comes with that. They love to hunt down those titles. They love to collect them. And most commentators, even Protestant commentators, say the same thing. Jesus is saying, don't give ultimate authority and these ultimate titles to man. Absolute fatherhood and absolute teaching authority belongs to God. Right? But we are allowed to have a human teacher and a human father and that type of thing. So it's more of an address against those who are seeking these titles at the level that God has these titles, right? And then Jesus says, but whoever is greatest among you will be your servant. He said this kind of things many times over. Now, normally people estimate greatness by how many people serve and honor them. But Jesus is reminding his followers that in the kingdom, everything's different, right? The Pharisees were very tough to others, but very lenient on themselves. And he's saying the way that we really master someone is to serve them. So now Jesus goes into this series of woes. I find this kind of funny. In Greek, the word is oe. Oe to you, scribes and Pharisees. And in Hebrew, the word is awi. That just cracks me up. Awi to you, scribes and Pharisees. Awis. So these woes stand in contrast with the Beatitudes of Matthew in chapter 5. Jesus is really getting tough on the Pharisees here, but it's not a personal irritation. It's not a personal dislike. He's talking here about a divine warning. This series of woes is really familiar from the Old Testament. The Old Testament prophets often did this. And this is not like, woe, horsey. It's not, woe is me. This is a woe, like a covenant curse. So we're just going to walk through these actually fairly quickly. In 13, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, you shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. The religious leaders are keeping people away from the kingdom of God by making human traditions and human religious rules more important than God's rules. They openly reject the message of Jesus and the message of heaven. It's bad enough for someone to say, no, I'm not going to follow Jesus, but it's far worse to stop someone else. And the religious leaders are leading people along the wrong path. In the first centuries, actually in the first century AD, at the time of Jesus, Pharisees had actually started going out to evangelize for Judaism. But Jesus says, you're going after converts, but you convert them to a false religion. You're not leading them to God. You're not leading them to truth. And then he talks about how these religious leaders make really bad oaths and swearing. Blind guides are those who cannot see where they're going. It's not very efficient, not very useful, not very safe. The Jews were supposed to only swear an oath in regard to a covenant or to an eyewitness testimony in a court of law, right? They grew into this habit with a system of oaths. And some were binding and some were not. And in their day, when you made an oath, when you made a promise, when you stated something, it really meant something. And to underscore it, to make it solid and binding, you would say, I swear to the Lord. But Jews knew they were never supposed to name the Lord. So over time, they started to get more and more substitutes. I swear on my mother's grave. I swear on the temple incense. I swear on my firstborn. Even I swear on the temple. But because these were objects, these were not God, right? These oaths are not binding. And through the years, the objects of the oath became not only not the temple, they started to become the gold of the temple. And not only would they swear on the altar, they would swear on the animal on the altar. And Jesus is saying, these oaths are meaningless. They're worthless. It's a way of making a promise while keeping your fingers crossed, right? Jesus emphasized that any real oath goes to God to make it legitimate, and all these other oaths are empty. And remember earlier in Matthew, he talks about let your yes be yes and your no be no. You don't need to make a bunch of oaths. So this had become really common in Israel at this time. Then he talks about woe to the scribes and Pharisees, the hypocrites, which it's one of his favorite words, right? You pay the tithe of mint and cumin and these little itty bitty tiny spices and these little dried herbs, but you're completely not doing the things that you're supposed to do. And he makes this hilarious line about straining out a little tiny gnat. But meanwhile, you swallow a camel, and a camel is not kosher. A camel is not allowed to be eaten. So what he's saying here is their tithing is all messed up. Another example of the Pharisees and the scribes adding rule upon rule upon rule. The way it's supposed to be, according to the law of Moses, 1/10 of the produce of the land was to be given as an offering to the temple. That included grain and wine and oil and fruits and even animals. But through the years, the Pharisees added more things, including the smallest herbs. So they meticulously, carefully measured out a tithe of the smallest plants, the smallest herbs, right? But they gave no true offering of justice or genuine mercy. They didn't pass on the faith, right? It was both possible and it was common to be distracted with these crazy details while everything else was falling apart around us. And that's the hilarious image that Jesus used. A man who's so committed to a kosher diet, he'd strain his tea rather than swallow a gnat, because a gnat was not kosher. They weren't supposed to eat a gnat. Yet, the same man, without paying any attention, would swallow an entire camel without thinking about it. It's the picture of someone who has completely lost his sense of proportion. So then in verse 25, the religious leaders are both are impure on the inside and the outside. And he says they're so satisfied with superficial cleansing, with the appearance of being righteous. They're concerned with the outside, but they're not concerned with the inside that's full of sin and full of corruption. And notice, Jesus doesn't call them to choose between outer righteousness and inner righteousness. He calls them to be concerned, but to address the inside first, because that's what's important. You know, that's where the drink comes from. That's the whole point of the cup, is what's on the inside, not what's on the outside. True outward righteousness starts with the outside. And then he says, once again, woe to you, scribes and Pharisees. This is my favorite one, verse 27. You're like whitewashed tombs. Now, it was the custom of the Jews that from time to time they would paint tombs in the city of Jerusalem, especially white, especially before Passover. So no one would accidentally touch them, would accidentally step on a bone, would accidentally make themselves unclean by walking right over a grave. Jesus says these religious leaders are like tombs that are white on the outside, they're pretty on the outside, they're obvious and noticeable, but on the inside they're dead. They're unclean. Right? Men might see them as righteous, but God did not see them as righteous. God is not fooled by what we show on the outside. And then he talks about the prophets. Woe to you, because you build the tombs of the prophets and adorn the monuments of the righteous. And you say, oh, if we had just lived in the days of our fathers, we would never have done any of that. They professed to venerate the dead prophets, but they rejected the living prophets. They showed they were really the children of those who murdered the prophet in the days of old, the prophets. And he calls them, St. John the Baptist's favorite term, you brood of vipers, you family of snakes. In other words, they're the family of the devil. These religious leaders took an unearned pride in their own heritage. And they were thinking because they're the spiritual sons of Abraham, they were just so glorious, but instead they're like sons of the devil. They're families of snakes. Now, there's a little detail in here that, I don't know, this is the kind of thing I love. Fast forward if you're not interested. But he talks about the blood of the righteous Abel to the blood of Zechariah, the son of Berechiah. So Jesus is talking about the righteous martyrs of the Old Testament, from Abel, the son of Adam and Eve, all the way to Zechariah, right? That blood was shed all the way through the Old Testament. That's what he's saying. But there's a little contradiction about who exactly this Zechariah is. In 2 Chronicles, which is the last book of the Hebrew Bible puts things in a little different order as opposed to the Greek Bible. Zechariah's story is found towards the end of 2 Chronicles in chapter 24. So what it's basically saying, Abel's blood cries out in Genesis 4, and Zechariah's blood is to be remembered in 2 Chronicles 24. Now there's a little problem with the description of Zechariah as the son of Berechiah, because in 2 Chronicles, he's called the son of Jehoiada. Now, double names were frequent among the Jews, so a lot of scholars just say it's simply that, and that the names Jehoiada and Berechiah are pretty close in meaning. They mean the praise or the blessing of Yahweh. But the Catholic Study Bible has a very good possibility of something different, that the prophet Zechariah, the prophet, was among the very last prophets of the Old Covenant, and he was the son of Berechiah. So the prophet Zechariah was the son of Berechiah, and the Jewish tradition, this is not in the Bible, it's not in the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, but the Jewish tradition that the rabbis taught said that he was murdered right near the altar of the temple. And that fits a little bit better. But whichever Zechariah we're talking about, the meaning is the same. Jesus is saying the blood has been crying out all the way through the Old Covenant. And then Jesus moves and to outside of the city walls, and he laments for Jerusalem. This is in verses 37 to 39. Jerusalem, Jerusalem. In Luke's gospel, Luke 19, he tells us that this happens before the triumphal entry into Jerusalem. So Luke puts this a little different. I have a conjecture as to why Matthew places it here. But Jesus weeps. He's weeping over Jerusalem. He's weeping over the coming judgment because he wants to protect his people. They're his people. And this is only happening because they have rejected him. And ultimately, they've rejected the Father. Jesus weeps 2 times in scriptures that we know of, here and at the tomb of Lazarus, right? I think the reason Matthew places this here is because Jesus doesn't hate these men he is so strongly rebuking. He's just given this series of woes, and his heart broke for them. And when we sin, God doesn't hate us. He's genuinely sorrowful for us. So I believe Matthew places this here to kind of soften that, to see that Jesus is weeping for them. The image of this hen, this bird protecting its young, is a common Old Testament image. And it alludes all the way back to chapter 1 of Genesis, when God hovers over the chaos and he starts to gather everything up into creation. Right? So now we flip the page to chapter 24. Now this is where it's going to get fun. Jesus goes out, he departs from his temple, from the temple, and he's going over down through the Kidron Valley and then back up to the Mount of Olives, to the Garden of Gethsemane, the area there. And he's looking back over the ravine at the temple. And when he does so, it's very strange. The disciples come up to him and it says they show him the buildings of the temple. Now, isn't that a little weird? It looks like Jesus departed, and the disciples point out the buildings. I think what this is, I think that after the really negative exchange Jesus just had with the religious leaders and all the woes, remember, the last several chapters have been in one day, and it's been very negative, and a lot of back and forth accusations and harsh words. I think the apostles are trying to change the mood. They're inviting Jesus to look back at the beauty and the majesty of that sacred structure. Surely God is there. And there will be a day when the temple is right and it is holy again. And Jesus, just look back, because that's the reason we're doing what they're doing. Cheer up, Jesus. Look at these beautiful buildings. That's their thought. But they have no idea what's about to happen. And they don't realize that Jesus is going to get even a little more gloomy. Remember that first temple, the first temple built on this very spot was by King Solomon, David's son. And the Babylonians destroyed it almost 600 years before Jesus. Then the second temple was originally built by Zerubbabel and Ezra. And it wasn't nearly as magnificent, but the second temple stood in the same place. And then King Herod, who ruled when Jesus was born, he greatly expanded and improved on this temple. Josephus tells us that Herod kept 10,000 workmen working about on this temple. Now, Herod's plan for rebuilding the temple started in 19 BC. So almost 20 years before Jesus, the temple had been started to be rebuilt from that second temple built by Zerubbabel and Ezra. And it took 80 years to complete the temple. So during this time that Jesus is alive, the temple is not complete. It's completed in 63 AD. Most of us don't have the image of that. It was still under construction through all this time. The temple was finished only 7 years before it was totally destroyed again, this time by the Romans. Now, I want you to realize how beautiful this building is. The temple was covered with gold plates, especially the Holy of Holies, the tallest part, the holy place where the priests went. And when the sun shone on them, this was a blinding building to look at. From miles and miles away in the distance, it looked like a shining light on the hill, right? The city that's like a light on the hill. And in the places where there were no gold, the blocks of marble, that white granite, was so polished, it was practically like a mirror itself. From a distance, strangers thought it looked like there was snow on the temple with a bright light, like almost like a lighthouse shining a bright light, even in the middle of the day, especially in the middle of the day, as it's reflecting the light. We can't emphasize how radically earth-shaking the event would be for the Jews to witness the destruction of their temple. Like, for us, it would be like the destruction of Washington, D.C., the Capitol building, all the national monuments and leaders, the destruction of Vatican City, all of St. Peter's Square, the Sistine Chapel, the Pope, and all the cardinals simultaneously. It was the whole center of Jewish life. And these stones and this building is massive. And what I want to make sure that you remember as we're marching through this for the next couple of sessions, this is a real temple. And it was really destroyed. There's a literal fulfillment of this prophecy that establishes the tone for what's coming after. So the setup here. Jesus goes to the Mount of Olives. He looks over the ravine. He's looking at those buildings. The apostles say, "Look at the beautiful temple. Isn't that awesome?" And then they say to him, after Jesus says, "I tell you, you're looking at that building, not one stone will be left upon another." And so they ask him, "Tell us, when will this be? What will be the sign of your coming? What will be the sign of the end of the age?" Now, it's really hard for us to, divorce ourselves from what we know and what we are thinking, because we're 2,000 years after the event. Think in terms of what the apostles are actually asking here. The apostles are probably asking one question, really. When is this going to happen? When are you going to come and destroy Rome? What are the signs? And we hear this and we immediately think that they're talking about, when is the temple going to be destroyed? When are you coming back for your second coming? And what are the signs of the very end of the world? That's kind of how most of us, especially as Protestants, most Protestants kind of see this. But the students of the Bible, as students of the Bible, we have to understand this is a Jewish mind that's not only writing this, Matthew's writing this, but what the apostles are asking him. We have to think about the way God has been talking to them for thousands of years. Okay, there's a couple things going on. God is talking to them, and Jesus is going to talk to them almost like in a parable. It's not going to make a whole lot of sense. Like the parables, what he's going to say now conceals the truth from those who do not have ears to hear. And it's going to reveal the truth for those who do have ears to hear. And the difficulty, as Christians through the centuries have tried to interpret this whole sermon that Jesus is about to give, how do we know what's the right interpretation? Well, you fear not, because I will share with you the correct interpretation. Of course. Okay, now, of course, there's going to be a lot of maybes in here. There's going to be a lot of blah, blah, blah. But on the other hand, there's going to be a lot of that. There's going to be a lot of, this is a mystery. And there's also going to be a lot of things like this polar opposite idea and that polar opposite idea are both true simultaneously. Okay, so just like everything else that we've studied from the Catholic perspective of the Bible, this is very mysterious. And why does God speak to us in riddles like this? Well, on one hand, just like I said, to reveal to the believers and to conceal to the enemies. Some people think that God keeps the future clouded in order to confound Satan, right? Kind of think about the Old Covenant, the Old Testament, all the prophecies that revealed the coming of the Messiah. Like on this side, after Jesus, when we read the New Testament, it's really obvious. But if you were living there at the time and you were trying to piece all these together, it would be very mysterious. And in what we are about to study, Jesus is talking about three things simultaneously. On one hand, now remember, Jesus is talking about this from his perspective. On one hand, most of these events happened almost identically the same back in the time of Isaiah and Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Daniel. The first temple and everything the Jews knew was utterly destroyed. Okay, that's the first thing, and he's looking backward through time. Then Jesus is clearly forecasting what's about to happen in the immediate future for him. What's going to happen in the lives of the apostles? This is what takes place between 30 AD and 70 AD when the temple is destroyed again. And it's already repeating what happened in 586 BC. But Jesus is also talking about a third thing, because this is going to apply to the end of the age. Maybe to the second coming of Jesus, to what St. Peter and St. John write about, a great destruction of the earth, out of which will come a new heavens and a new earth, a massive period of tribulation. And get this, this is really cool. This is really, really cool. I might have known this before, but I had forgotten it. In fact, I'm sure I learned this when we did the Bible timeline the very first time through Jeff Cavins. I had totally forgotten this. To make the point that this is a repeat event, that the destruction of the temple is under God's control, right? He doesn't cause this, but he allows this to purify his people. He allows this to reboot, to start over. And here's one of the signs that we know. There's just no way this is coincidence. The first temple of Solomon was destroyed on the 9th day of Ab. Tisha B'Av. It's called the 9th day of Ab. It's a day of mourning for the Jews, even to this day. It's in the summer, like around July. In 586 BC, on the 9th day of the month of Ab, the temple was destroyed. The second temple, the temple of Herod, a little bit after the time of Jesus, the second temple is destroyed on Tisha B'Av, the 9th day of the month of Ab, in 70 AD. The exact same day, 656 years later. Now, there's some really great notes in our study Bible. There's an entire page explaining some of this. But what we're going to look at as we march forward, we're going to look at what happened in the past, what happens shortly after the time of Jesus, and then what's still in our future. What about the age to come for us too? So recognize the temple is destroyed once, the temple is destroyed twice, and the temple is a representation of the whole world. The world is a macro temple. Temple is a sign, a symbol of the world. The temple is a micro world. Does that make sense? Do you get that? They explain it much better in the study Bible. This temple represents the world. And what happened to the first temple happens to the second temple and will happen to the world. Can't wait for next time. This is going to be very interesting and somewhat preparatory. Be ready for some prayer for what's about to come. Amen. Thanks for joining me, everyone. I appreciate you so much. Thank you for sharing the word with me. God bless. Thank you so much for walking the way through the Gospel of Matthew.